Welcome to episode 274 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Diane Harsha, who served in the FBI for 29 years. In this episode, Diane reviews an exploitation of children's case involving a man who posed as a potty training expert in order to take nude photos of a toddler for his sexual gratification. She also talks about working in a small resident agency, FBI's satellite office, and the importance of relying on local law enforcement partners. She dedicates this case review to former colleagues from the Moniteau County Sheriff's Office in Missouri who were killed in the line of duty during a tragic domestic abuse call. We talk about that too. Diane's work experience and areas of expertise included general criminal, counterterrorism, and crisis negotiations. During her career, she was assigned to the Kansas City field office at the Jefferson City Resident Agency in Missouri, the Detroit field office, Ligat Rabat in Morocco, and the Memphis division at the Nashville Resident Agency in Tennessee. She was also deployed on many overseas temporary duty assignments, including to Iraq and Guantanamo Bay. During and after her FBI career, Diane pursued her love of hiking and the outdoors. In 2017, she completed the 2,200-mile Appalachia Trail, which she began section hiking in 2005. Diane is the author of Sticks and Stones: How to Hike the Appalachian Trail in 13 Years, her memoir about the journey. I get a chance to ask her what that was like at the end of the case review. Now, before we get to the interview, I heard some of you did not get the full audio file for episode 272, the case review about the family annihilation with former FBI profiler Mark Safrick. Sorry about that. The file was fixed, but if you didn't get to hear the full episode, what you're going to have to do is to mark the episode in your podcast app as played and delete it, and then re-download episode 272. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened, but you don't want to miss the conclusion of that case review. It is unbelievable. As is this case review with Diane Harsha. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes, as well as to how you can buy me a coffee, join my reader team, and check out my crime fiction and nonfiction books. Don't forget to follow me on social media. I'm at Jerry Williams1 on Instagram and Twitter, and Jerry Williams Author on Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Diane Sticks Harsha. Hi, Diane.
Hi, Jerry.
Well, let people know where the nickname Sticks comes from at the very end of the episode when we have a chance to talk about your book, Sticks and Stones: How to Hike the Appalachian Trail in 13 Years. But for now, we're going to be talking about a case that you worked early in your career. So why don't you give us a brief introduction to the case, what it's about, and where you were in your career, what you were assigned to in the FBI when you were working the case, and then we'll get into all the details.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Jerry, for having me on your podcast. I've listened to several of your episodes, and I'm a fan. I know it's been a big hit in the retired agents community as well as elsewhere. I'm very happy to be here. So when you and I first discussed the possibility of me being a guest on your show, I started thinking back on my career, of course, and different cases that I'd worked, and thinking of one that might be interesting to your listeners. The one I want to talk about did happen early in my career. I debated a little bit about talking about it because it is a disturbing case. It's a very sordid case, but it has stuck with me all these years. I've thought about it from time to time because it is so disturbing, and also because it really ended in tragedy of some of the players that were involved, some of the law enforcement players that were involved. The tragedy was not related to the case, but these were the officers that I worked with on this case. And shortly after the end of the case, there was this tragedy that befell this community. That's another reason this case has sort of stuck with me all these years, because I've thought about the folks that were involved in it. I was first office assigned to the Kansas City division. I came into the Bureau in 1985, went to Kansas City out of Quantico. And Kansas City is the field office that covers the western half of the state of Missouri. And I had been in Kansas City for 2 or 3 years, and I requested a transfer to the Jefferson City Resident Agency, what we call an RA. And this would have been in 1989-ish. I'll just explain briefly to your listeners. I know you know this terminology, but I'm not sure all your listeners will know exactly what a resident agency does and how it fits into the schematics of the FBI. As you know, the FBI is domestically divided into field offices across the United States. They're located in major cities. And in the case of Missouri, you have 2 field offices. You have Kansas City, which, as I said, covers the western part of the state, and you have St. Louis, which covers the eastern half of Missouri. These field offices are then broken down into further smaller satellite offices throughout the territory that we call RAs. And so these RAs are generally small. They can consist of as little as 2 agents to larger RAs in a bit larger cities. But in any case, the RAs are fairly bare-boned operations. The agents that are assigned to them still report to the field offices in terms of that's where the paperwork goes, that's where the bosses are, the executives, where the support staff is, where prosecutors are, federal court systems, etc. When I moved to the Jefferson City RA, at that time was a 3-person RA, 3 agents. My responsibility was to cover several counties. I don't remember how many exactly, perhaps 7 or 8 in the south central part of Missouri. When you're assigned to a field office, Kansas City, for example, you're going to be working on a squad, whether it's a bank robbery squad or a surveillance squad, a white-collar crime squad, public corruption squad, counterterrorism squad. But if you're in a small RA, then you're going to respond to whatever criminal activity that would fall under federal jurisdiction within your territory. That might be bank robberies, it might be fugitives, it might be public corruption, whatever is in those counties. Of course, that means working well with and closely with local counterparts, the sheriff's departments, the police departments, most of them fairly small, and covering a large geographical territory, but working with small numbers of personnel. So these 7 or 8 counties, which I covered in south central Missouri, were very rural, mostly farming, ranching, with the small communities that support those industries, these small little towns. One of the counties which I covered was Moniteau County, a couple of counties west of Jefferson City. And the county seat is California. It's the name of the town. Just a small, typical town, clean, pretty, very friendly people. And as with all of the counties that I covered, I got to know the sheriff very well. We had worked together on several different cases, bank robberies, fugitives. We knew each other from law enforcement conferences or other interagency events, etc. There was a mutual respect and dependence, and it was always made clear that I could be contacted anytime if the sheriffs in these counties or the police departments felt like they needed a federal presence. I had been in Jefferson City in the RA there for maybe a year or so. It must have been late 89 or early 1990. And I got a call from Sheriff Kinney of Moniteau County or maybe the first call might have come from one of his deputies, Russ, who went on to be sort of the lead investigator in this case, and we went on to work very closely with. But whoever, Sheriff Kenny or Russ, contacted me and said, hey, we got a situation here you probably need to know about, and it looks like it's going to be some interstate involvement. We're probably going to need your help. The situation was explained to me, and it was basically this. Moniteau County Sheriff's Department had received a call from a concerned citizen who had observed a young man taking photographs of a naked young child, toddler age, at a small playground there in the town of California. This was in the summertime, so weather was warm. So, of course, a deputy was dispatched to this playground. And when he got there, he indeed finds a young man, maybe in his mid-20s, who was identified as Don Salata. And with him was a little boy, 2 or 3 years old, and they are just outside of a van, a white panel van, parked there in the parking lot. And it has Wisconsin plates on it, out-of-state plates on it. And so the deputy, of course, gets the information from Don Salata there, who is cooperative, and basically tells the deputy, no, this is not my child, but I have his parents' permission to be here with him. I am potty training him, and his parents know it. No problem, he's telling the deputy. And the deputy says, well, we need to talk to the parents and we need to get some further information about this. And Salata continues to cooperate, gives them the name and contact information for the parents who live there in the town of California. And the deputy says, mind if we take a look in your van while we're waiting for the parents to get here? Sure, he says. So the deputy does just a very sort of cursory consent search of the van, just enough to see that there is a lot of stuff in that van that is very suspicious. Boxes and boxes of magazines and letters and envelopes and drawings and photographs, some of which are depicting children, what could be construed as pornography. So Salata is taken into custody. The parents have arrived on the scene. They take the child. And at that point, along in there, that's when I am contacted. I drive the hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it is, over to California. And by this time, Salata is in the sheriff's department and continues to be cooperative. He agrees to be interviewed by me. He signs a Miranda waiver and he is interviewed. And basically, he tells me this story that he is an expert in potty training children. And he has published articles about it, and he has done research, and this is what his education is in. He denies any involvement with pornography or with any sexual exploitation of children, that it is all part of his training. In the meantime, I have contact my supervisors back in Kansas City, let them know what's going on, contact the U.S. Attorney's Office in Kansas City to advise them of the situation, that we had some potential charges of interstate transportation of obscene material and or sexual exploitation of children. By this time, the proper people have been notified, and state charges are being brought at that time against Salata while we are considering what the federal response is going to be. I talked to the parents at some point during those first few hours, during that first day, and the parents of the child who was with Salata at the parking lot. They were very cooperative. At first were somewhat supportive of Salata in the sense that, no, we trust him, he's an expert in this, etc. We found his name from a reputable source, and all of that was true. They had had trouble potty training this child, who was an only child, and they felt that he was getting to the age where he should be potty trained.
You had initially said that he was 2 or 3, but maybe he was 3 or 4?
That's my point, is that they felt like he should be potty trained, but you're exactly right. I mean, that is not an age where one would expect complete potty training by any means. The child was young enough that he was not able to communicate very well with us. So the parents had concerns, and they found in a reputable magazine, at the back of this magazine, an ad for personal potty training. And it was contact information for Salata, who they contacted and who they had various telephone conversations with. Suggestions were made, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, at his suggestion, they agreed to let him travel from Wisconsin down to California to personally potty train this child. At first, the meetings between child and Salata were held in the family home, but then eventually they let him take the child out to the park, where eventually he was observed photographing the child. Of course, the family was appalled and very upset when they were informed of the items that were found inside the van, and were extremely ashamed and felt very guilty, and of course did the right thing in terms of taking the child to make sure that there had been no abuse of the child, or taking the child to the doctor, et cetera. That was how the relationship between this family and Salata had developed, and that's why he was in Missouri. A much more thorough search was conducted of the van, and the background investigation was done on Salata in terms of where he was from, where he lived, that sort of thing. And the evidence was transferred from California, Missouri, to my office there in Jefferson City. And there were boxes and boxes and boxes of various articles, items. What's important to note here is that this was pre-internet days. This were the days when people communicated, by and large, at least photographic images, through the U.S. mail. There were fax, to some degree, I think there was early in the days of fax machines. I believe there were some faxes in the van, but by and large, it was photographic images in envelopes that had been transferred through the U.S. mail with postage. As all of this evidence was laid out on the floor of my office, in the hallway, and on my desk, every available space that we could to capture it, to inventory it, to then photograph it, because we needed to disseminate it to the appropriate field offices. We were also in the process of getting a search warrant for Salata's home in Wisconsin. He was being held in custody at that time. He was still in state custody there in Moniteau County.
This may also be a good time for you to explain to everyone why the FBI is there. You have the state, the local police pursuing state charges. So why did they call you?
Okay, there's a couple of factors there. First of all was just the interstate aspect of it. This person was not a local person. He had traveled from Wisconsin. He had a vehicle with out-of-state plates. A local sheriff's department does not really have the resources, the contacts in other states that the FBI has. So initially, they may have just looked at it from that angle. We need to find out more about this guy, and we may need the FBI's help because the FBI will have contacts, obviously, all across the United States. So initially, it may have just been maybe the FBI can assist us in getting some more information about this person. But there are also federal laws regarding transportation of child pornography. Interstate transportation of child pornography is a federal offense. While there are state charges that also apply, there are those federal charges as well. So it was sort of two facets, two answers to that question. It was the fact that there was this local/federal assistance, but there was also that there was federal jurisdiction, a potential federal jurisdiction involved.
Great, thank you.
As we looked at the evidence and continued to inventory the evidence, that became more and more clear that there were going to be many different field offices potentially involved. which would have been difficult, if not impossible, for Moniteau County with their limited resources and limited jurisdiction, frankly, to have been able to completely do a thorough investigation and to reach out to all of the different law enforcement entities that may be involved. As we were looking at the evidence, at the different pieces of evidence, what we were doing was taking each photograph, each envelope, the contents of each envelope, and trying to determine where they originated from. For example, you would have an envelope addressed to Salata there in Wisconsin, and inside the envelope would be photographs of a nude child or photographs of a partially clad child. And this photograph would be accompanied by a letter, for example. And in the letter, there would be a description of the photo, or there would be comments about the photo, or there would be reference to masturbation or sexual references. And the envelope many times would have a return address on it. This is not uncommon among people who obtain child pornography and exchange child pornography, is that they are keepers. And even in this case, including keeping the envelopes with the return addresses on them. So we were able to compile a long inventoried list of persons who had sent these images, letters, photos through the U.S. mail. We then drafted the appropriate communications and setting out the appropriate leads to these various field offices with the information particular to that specific field office. So, for example, you would have the name of Joe Smith at 123 Main Street, Chicago, Illinois. And we would send a communication, or we send a communication to the Chicago field office, including the description and the information of the evidence that had been sent from that particular person from that particular location. And then it was up to that particular field office, to the agent who received that information from me, to confer with his or her U.S. Attorney's office and determine if there was enough evidence in that communication for a search warrant of that particular location and or an arrest of that particular person. And so we sent leads to that effect to several field offices. I don't want to exaggerate, but I would say upwards of 24 or so. And in some of those field offices may have had multiple locations. There may have been more than one subject, more than one location that had sent the material to Salata.
So not only are you corroborating the evidence that you have against Salata, you are now identifying and setting out leads for potentially more investigations of the people that he had been in contact with and exchanging images of child sexual abuse.
Exactly, yes. There were also some instances where he had various names jotted down in his little address book or on sheets of notepaper or whatever that may have not had any images directly associated with them, but still could have had potential value as witnesses or people who may have had knowledge about this activity. Those were also included. There was upwards of 24 field offices. Most of them were in the Midwest. I think there were a couple in the state of California. I believe LA had a couple, but they were mostly the Midwestern states. I don't want to get too graphic here, but these people shared a specific fetish. They were interested in children, mostly boys, of a very young age, toddler to maybe 6, 7 years old, who were not potty trained. So they were interested in children wearing diapers and children wearing rubber pants. To some degree, that posed a little bit of an issue because we all have pictures, photographs of our children wearing diapers or our children on the potty or our children in the bathtub. And in our eyes, that's just, there's nothing obscene about that.
Or sexual.
or sexual, right? I mean, it's just cute and charming or whatever. But this is what sexually aroused this particular group of people. But again, is that defined as pornography? Right? If you and I look at it, we would say no. And so, what actually defined it, or which would make a prosecutor be able to look at it and say, okay, this is how we can use this statute, is that the letters, the narrative that accompanied these images referred to sexual gratification, referred to masturbation, or went into lurid description of the photograph. I mean, there were even things as benign as pages torn out of magazines for various ads. Again, is that pornography? So there was a lot of going through all of these boxes and boxes and separating out what no one would define as pornography. And then what could maybe possibly is this, I don't know. Eventually, it comes down to what a prosecutor thinks that he or she would be able to convince a judge or jury of what would be pornography.
Let me ask you this question, because the initial complaint was of him taking a photo of this little boy naked in the nude. So
Correct.
there were also, it sounds like there were also photos of kids that were totally undressed, not in diapers.
Yes.
And those, there were no questions about, I would assume.
Right. Yeah, that was the initial complaint, was that there was a nude child. And of course, we had the camera. This was back in the days of film. And that, in fact, turned out to be the case.
Also, I think, and you're not wanting to be too graphic, one of the documents that you sent me was a state appellate court ruling. And they described some of the photos as also not just the kids in the diapers, but the kids in their diapers are in the middle of being changed with the, I don't know how to say this, the contents of the diapers exposed. Not only was it just, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I understand you're wanting to be delicate, and we can still do that, I hope. The part of their fetish was not just the diapers itself, but the fact that these were soiled diapers, and they had pictures of the kids actually with the excrement or number 2 or number 1 was part of that also.
Yes. And I don't think any of us can say that that was not pornography, in the sense that that was outside the norm. We could take pictures of our children in their cute little diapers or whatever. But I don't think that most people would find taking photographs of a soiled diaper or a child in a soiled diaper in any way charming or cute. That was their particular fetish. This group of people who communicated through the mail, they referred to themselves as a fraternity. I mean, they had made these connections over the years that these folks, and how they initially found each other is beyond, I don't know. But there was this underground, and I suppose this is probably true of any fetish that's out there. These folks find each other and exchange this information. So it wasn't just a couple of people with this very aberrant fetish. There were many people, and I suspect there were many, many, many more that we, of course, had no information about. To move on with the investigation, over the first several days or so, Salata was indicted federally. Meanwhile, these leads had gone out to the various field offices. Searches were conducted. Search was conducted of the subject's home in Wisconsin. And that, of course, generated other leads, other searches, and it continued to develop from there. As this went on, we continued to generate other leads. I tried to look back through newspaper articles, and because they were sort of variously across the United States with various different names and locations, I don't recall the exact number of people who were actually arrested and sentenced or pled. And I want to say maybe 8 or 9 altogether. And out of the Kansas City division, there was just Salata, and he was also held on state charges. That was the investigation in a very synopsized way. I feel like the reason maybe it would still resonate today is that because obviously people don't do this through the U.S. mail probably anymore, but the access is so much easier now with the internet. And I feel like I don't want to make parents paranoid or to be over vigilant, but It disturbs me even now when I see people posting things on Facebook, for example, of young children that, again, you and I would not find in any way pornographic or inappropriate, but some people might, some people do, and some people will. So I feel like it's important to point out as like maybe a little reminder that what we find inoffensive, other folks are going to exploit. Maybe there's a lesson in all that to be learned. And then as the case wrapped up, I was transferred to Detroit Division.
Did we finish talking about what happened with Salata, his sentencing for both state and for federal?
I don't really recall the sentence that he got. I did try to find out a little more information about it. I simply couldn't recall. But for the record now, I'll say that he was sentenced to several years as well as on the state charges.
And did he plea or was this a trial?
No, there was no trial. I don't recall testifying in trial. I do recall the grand jury indictment. And so there was a plea. Mm-hmm.
I like to talk a little bit more about being an agent in a very small RA. And you did mention the fact that you have to be like a jack of all trades when it comes to different violations. Had you worked this type of crimes against children before, and had you had any type of training or counseling? Because I would imagine looking at these photos and dealing with this case could cause some emotional strain, emotional tension for the person, the investigators.
Well, yes, I think it is one of those cases that you tend to take home with you, and it's hard to kind of shake from your mind. I had been a police officer before I was in the FBI, and so I had worked various general criminal. When I came in the FBI, my first office was in Kansas City, where I was on the bank robbery squad and then a surveillance squad. So no, I did not have experience in this sort of thing. My background was not in child behavior or psychology or anything like that. So there was some trauma involved in it, I suppose. But, really, how could you have any kind of training for that sort of investigation, really? It's so out of the mainstream of the sorts of things that we might work. Of course, now in the bigger offices, there are entire squads that are dedicated to child pornography and investigating those sorts of crimes. But no, I personally did not have any background in it.
So that really highlights the importance of somebody assigned to a resident agency, an RA, having some type of experience in law enforcement before they get that type of assignment, because they have no idea what they're going to be working.
That's exactly right. And I think the key to it also is just the cooperation between local law enforcement and the FBI and these small RAs. Because you're geographically removed from the field office. You don't have a support network. I mean, if something happens, it's going to take a while for other agents to get there. And so there has to be that willingness and that openness to work with local law enforcement agencies. And at that time, I was young. I came into the Bureau pretty young. And even though I did have a few years of police experience, I did not have a lot of FBI experience. There was, I think, a little bit of reluctance, at first to send me to that small of an RA. And it was a position I requested. I wanted to move there.
Any particular reason?
That I wanted to move there? I had become engaged at that time, and my soon-to-be husband was living in St. Louis, and Jefferson City was closer to St. Louis. It was purely personal reasons. But I also really thought I would like the work in a small RA. I really did. I really thought, I'd like to be down there, work with local law enforcement, get a wide variety of experience. So it was first and foremost a personal decision initially, but it was something I really wanted to do as well. And I think, as it turned out, that it did work out very well. I think I did get along very well with the local law enforcement, and we had very good relationships, and it was a very successful part of my career. And it's one that I'm glad I was able to get that wide variety of experience. It's very possible to spend your whole career just working on one squad or working with one specialty, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But for me, I was glad to have that variety.
And I guess also in talking about your experience really highlights the fact that the misconception and cliche that the FBI doesn't work well with others is indeed a misconception or a myth. because when it comes to working in RAs, it is absolutely crucial and necessary for the FBI to rely on the assistance of their local partners.
Absolutely. And I think it is one of the myths that I am always happy to correct. Somebody will say, oh, well, we hear this, or what's the biggest misconception about the FBI that we see on TV that's really not true? That's what I'll go to. I'll say, I don't like it when it's portrayed in movies or TV or whatever, that it's like, okay, here's the FBI, step aside. Because I don't feel like it's that at all. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, you point that out in your book as well, that there is that misconception.
Oh, yeah. It's my number 2 myth. Number 1 being that FBI profilers are chasing down serial killers. but number 2,
Come on.
It was like a struggle to decide which one was number 1.
Yeah.
But because of so many movies and the fact that serial killer books are their own genre, that I had to choose that as number 1. But close behind that one was number 2, which is that the FBI doesn't play well with others.
Right, for sure. For sure. We will continue to bust that myth. There was a tragedy there in Moniteau County, and it has stuck with me too all these years because I had worked with these law enforcement officers so closely, and they were so helpful and so professional and so appreciative of having the FBI's assistance and resources in this particular case. I'll just sort of give you the synopsis of what happened, this tragedy there in Moniteau County. There was a domestic disturbance call, and a Moniteau County deputy, who I knew, of course, through this investigation, was dispatched to the scene, and he was shot and later died. The subject, his name was James Johnson, escaped, left the scene. He then went to Sheriff Kenny's house, who was not home. The sheriff was out responding to this officer down situation. And Johnson shot through the window of Sheriff Kenny's home and killed his wife, who was conducting a church meeting. Johnson then continued his rampage. He went back to the sheriff's department where law enforcement officers from different agencies were gathering to start this manhunt, to process crime scenes, etc. And he shot 2 more officers there and killed them. And then he again fled. He went to another deputy's home, Deputy Russ, who you may remember at the beginning of our talk, I had referred to him as he was one of the lead investigators on the pornography case. He went to Russ's home and shot him, just as Russ was getting home from responding to the other calls. He fortunately survived. Johnson was eventually apprehended and then about a decade later was executed by the state of Missouri. That was such a tragic chapter for this department.
Yeah, that must have been. Were you still in the area at the time, or had you transferred to Detroit?
I had transferred to Detroit, but I was still in contact sporadically with these folks. I had not been transferred long when the incident happened. I think I had looked back at some articles, and the incident happened in December, and I had gone to Detroit in the spring of that year. So it was few to several months later after.
What was the shooter's beef? I mean, he seemed to know these deputies and where they lived.
Yeah, well, he was former military. He had weapons. He was versed in the use of weapons. He did not have a criminal history other than he had had some domestic disputes in the past. You have to remember, Jerry, this is a very small town where it would not have been uncommon for most people to know where the sheriff lived. It wouldn't have been uncommon to know where deputies lived. They would probably have had their cars parked in front of their houses. So I don't think that it was hard to find them. I think his motive was strictly rage, strictly violence, that he was just a very violent person who was obviously upset that the police had come to his house and responded to this domestic disturbance call, and he took his vengeance.
Wow. It's just a very sad commentary about policing. And this happened years ago.
Yeah, it really was such a tragedy. And I know it doesn't have anything to do with the case, but I think it's just one reason why that case had stayed with me all these years, is because those people were such good liaisons, such good counterparts. And yeah, it is a commentary on how difficult and how dangerous the local policing is. And the fact that two of the officers that were killed weren't from that particular agency. They had responded as, of course, deputy down. Officers were coming in from agencies surrounding the area. That's what you do. You respond. And then before the investigation can even start, dang, two more.
And those were the two that were at
the sheriff's department, which the sheriff's department is also the jail. I mean, it's a local courthouse, sheriff's department, jail, sort of everything all there right there in one.
Definitely a tragic incident. Very sad. It just kind of leaves me like, I don't know what to say. Yeah.
I mean, it really is. It's not one of your more uplifting episodes, I'm sure. But law enforcement that's the nature of it, right? I mean, there are some positive days when we feel like we're keeping the wheels of justice turning and where there is gratitude from victims. But there are these gritty details are really not very pleasant and can really haunt you for a long time.
All right. I think it's time now that we learn a little bit more about you. Now, I did read your bio at the beginning, so listeners know a little bit about you, but they don't know why and when you joined the FBI. So could you tell us more about what made you interested in becoming an FBI agent?
Well, I had been interested in it for a long time, even as a child. I watched TV shows about it, or even when I was in high school and you're assigned to do a term paper, I would do it about the FBI. And it was something I never really thought that I would be able to pursue because I came up in the 70s and there weren't FBI agents that looked like me. In fact, women agents didn't come in until 72 or 73, and then they were few and far between during that decade. But when I went to college, I decided to study criminal justice, and I thought, well, if I can't be an FBI agent, I'll still work in the criminal justice field. That's what interests me. I was in a class, and an FBI agent came and spoke to our class. This would have been in 1980, maybe. He was very informative, and he says, yeah, we're hiring, and here's what the basic qualifications are. And I went up to him after the class and talked to him one-on-one and said, hey, this has always been sort of in the back of my mind, but I really don't know if I can do it. I'm physically a very small person. He was very, very helpful, very encouraging, and gave me some very specific information on how to pursue that path. I think it was literally the next day. I went to the Huntsville Police Department and applied for a job as a police officer because by that time I had learned that one of the paths to becoming an FBI agent was to get some practical experience. And so I thought, well, I'm in college. I'll try to get a job as a police officer and then go from there. That's what happened. I worked as a police officer while I finished up my degree. And when I finished my degree, by that time I had 4 years or so as a police officer and applied to the FBI. That was in 1985.
Well, you told us about the different offices that you were assigned to, but what was your primary specialization or did you have one?
I was on several different squads until 9/11 happened. And then, as you know, Jerry, and probably most of your listeners know, the Bureau changed. From 9/11 on, I worked strictly counterterrorism. When 9/11 happened, of course, that was in 2001, was about midway through my career. I would classify the first half of my career as sort of general criminal, and then the second half as counterterrorism. And I was in Nashville by that time. I was in the Nashville Resident Agency, RA. I was also the Memphis Division, which Nashville RA reports to Memphis, Crisis Negotiations Coordinator. While we call that a collateral duty, it was still a very important part of my career and required a lot of teaching and travel and that sort of thing. I would say that those two things, counterterrorism and negotiations, were my areas of specialty, particularly in the latter half of my career.
When did you retire and what are you doing now?
I retired in 2014. I had been eligible for a few years. As you know, agents are eligible at age 50 if they have enough years of service in. I became eligible at the age of 50. I thought about it for a couple of years and wasn't quite ready. And then as I approached my mid-50s, my eyesight wasn't getting any better. I didn't feel like I was keeping up with the technology. I felt like there were signs that it was time to go. I decided to retire in 2014. At that time, I had taken up hiking as a hobby in my late 40s. I often went on week-long backpacking hiking trips. But because of my career and because I was still raising a family at that time, those trips were of fairly short duration. Once I retired, I said, okay, now I'm retired. I can take this hobby of backpacking and extend it to fulfilling this dream I had of completing the Appalachian Trail. That's what I did. Once I retired, I took longer and longer trips of longer and longer duration and hiked the Appalachian Trail. And I finished that in 2017. All in all, it took me 13 years to finish the Appalachian Trail. And once I finished it in 2017, I thought, well, what's my next project going to be? I decided to write a book regarding my 13-year odyssey on the AT. That was my project for the next year and a half or so. Getting the book published was the next project because, as you know, writing a book and getting it published are two different things altogether. That is how I have spent my retirement years up to now. And the book, I'll just briefly say, is not just about hiking the AT because I was hiking while I was still working. And so there is this, I hope, narrative about the balance of career and family and hobby, which in my case was hiking, and how all of that sort of came together to work for me anyway.
Absolutely fascinating. The book, again, is called Sticks and Stones: How to Hike the Appalachian Trail in 13 Years. And I've had a chance to read it. When I was first reading it, I did think about the fact that during your career and during the time that you were raising a family, that you would physically leave and do these trails. And I thought about how that was as a mother. And then I compared it to me trying to write books and to dedicate my time in being at least mentally away, where I would ask people, don't bother me, don't talk to me, let me sit down and write my book. And I could see the very similar path as a mother and as an agent and as a wife, wanting to have that time where you can pursue your own personal dreams and goals. And I could relate.
Well, absolutely. And I think that crosses all fields, whatever your career is. It's important to have that sense of separation to some degree and how it all works well together. I mean, I think that the fact that I was able to sort of do my own thing from time to time made me a better wife and mother. It made me a better agent because I could come back and be more refreshed and more engaged with what was going on immediately and focus. And then after a while, I'll say, oh, okay. A few weeks go by, a few months, I need to get away again. I can't say enough to people how important that is to prevent burnout, to prevent stagnation, to come back and have a fresh view of things. I look at it as that tripod approach. You need all three legs, right, to be sort of wholly balanced, I guess. At least that's the way it worked for me.
And your three legs, your tripod would consist of
career, family, and hiking.
And I think what people need to know when we're talking about the book and your hiking is that a lot of times you did this with other women friends, especially other female agents. But most of the time, or many of the times, you went out solo for days and weeks, just walking the trail by yourself, meeting people along the way. There were times reading the book where there was danger, that danger coming from the elements, from the weather or the complexity of the trail. And I think to myself, oh my God, she was out there by herself. If something were to happen, the only way that people would know that is that you did not make those check-in calls when you got to a place where you had phone service.
Right. Yeah. Most of the time I was solo, particularly the last several years, because the further and further I got up the trail, the further it was from my home. So it required travel. I'd take off work for longer. And a lot of my friends, most of my friends were still working or still had children at home and they couldn't get away for the long periods of time. So yeah, I was by myself a lot of the time. And there was danger. I don't want to minimize the Appalachian Trail, the challenge that it is. It is not an easy trail. There was danger from, as you correctly point out, mostly from the elements, although most people seem to feel like when they question me about it, like they assume that I would be more afraid of being alone and meeting other people and the dangers that come from other people. that was not the case. The dangers come from the elements, which is, again, not to say that there aren't crazy people out there, as we all know, but that was never really a concern of mine. But for many women, unfortunately, it is. They're more afraid of
Getting murdered.
Oh, exactly.
That's
Which
the hashtag, don't get murdered.
the chances of that happening are so minuscule, but that is the fear that keeps us from doing these things that we want to do. And not to minimize and not to say that we shouldn't be cautious and we shouldn't use common sense and all of those things, but that is what stops people, I think, so many times, particularly women, from doing what they want to do, or they think, oh, wow, that sounds really cool and really a good idea, but I don't think I could sleep alone in a tent on the trail.
Now you say that, and I asked you a question. When you were doing it, when you were going out there by yourself, again, for weeks at a time, you probably thought, yeah, this is cool. I can handle it. But my question to you is, when your daughter, when she took up the hobby and she started backpacking solo, what were your thoughts then?
That's a really good point. Yeah, then I had those thoughts, right? What did you get murdered? Why did you get sleep alone in a tent on the trail? Which was, of course, all the things that I had done. But yeah, we were very nervous for it. But I suppose when it's your child and there's that sense of mother bear protection, coming in. But I suppose, in hindsight, I have no one but myself to blame for doing those crazy things.
Absolutely. But definitely your independence and your courageousness is something that you passed on along to your daughter. And that's absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you. And I think it was just one of those unintended consequences or one of the unintended benefits. I don't think I set out to say, oh, watch this and you be this or you follow in my footsteps. Maybe we do that all along anyway, unconsciously, whatever we choose to do as a career or as a hobby, is that we are setting an example and we are being role models, whether we realize it or not. Maybe it's important to remind ourselves of that from time to time so that we continue to be positive role models.
Absolutely. And was this book from journals that you kept along the way?
I really didn't keep journals. I kept some notes. I kept all my maps. I took a lot of photographs. I was able to sort of reconstruct it chronologically using my maps and photographs and the notes of particular days I went, who was with me on those particular days. Then I could just sort of recreate it from there. I wish I had journaled more, and I advise people now to do that. I wish I had journaled more as an FBI agent. I just think whatever your field is, whatever your path in life is, to be able to reconstruct that later on is a gift. And I felt like writing the book was a gift to me because I could relive it. I did recreate it for my own personal enjoyment. It was almost more fun doing it the second time. I could do it from the comfort of my own home.
Oh, very good. The book again, and I highly recommend it, is Sticks and Stones, How to Hike the Appalachian Trail in 13 Years. And throughout it, it's not a book about your FBI career. It is a book solely about hiking the trail, but there are little tidbits here and there about where you were in your career and the times that you had to take off in order to complete this journey. And I will put it into my FBI reading resource list of books by FBI agents, usually more about the FBI, but I'll include it there for anyone who would be interested in reading it. And of course, I will have a link to where it can be purchased in the show notes for this episode on my website, jerrywilliams.com.
Thank you, Jerry, very much for having me.
Diane Sticks Harsha. So what does the STICKS stand for?
I know you know because you've read the book. But if your listeners want to know, I guess you're going to have to read the book.
And so we have one last thing to do, and that is I like to give my guest the very last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, I guess I would say as the last word or as the last takeaway for your listeners is that, as this case demonstrates, there's a lot of messed up things out there in the world. And unfortunately, we in our careers do see the underbelly, so to speak. But we have to always put that aside. We see the good things too, which was that, again, in this particular case, the cooperation with the local law enforcement and the knowledge that the wheels of justice do turn and things do get done And that even though the tragedies and the hard times is sort of like hiking, there's the elements, there's the cold weather, there's the dangerous winds, there's the lonely nights, but there's also the beauty of the trail itself. That's what I would like to impart, is that we take the good along with the bad and along with the very, very ugly.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Diane Harsha, some articles and documents related to the case review, and a link to where you can purchase her book, Sticks and Stones: How to Hike the Appalachian Trail in 13 Years. You'll also find links to other FBI Retired Case File Review episodes featuring crimes against children investigations. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.